Ладно, давайте одной кабиной пользоваться. Ну, вы здесь сидите пока, отдыхайте там, или там вот.
Я приду еще.
А вы микрофоны готовы? Они могут потом меняться, потому что... One of the most actively debated writers and one of the most prominent writers in the area of economic theory of development. The Gaidar Foundation, the Gaidar Endowment, last year published yet another book by this author, The Tyranny of Experts, and this is exactly what this session will focus on. And during the Q&A session, you will be able to ask your questions regarding this book, as well as the previous books by Professor Easterly, as well as just about any issue related to the economy of growth. But before getting to the Q&A session, Professor Easterly has prepared a small presentation, and now I would like to give him the floor.
Работаем в одной кабине. Та не работает. Я тебя сменю здесь в 9:50.
Thank you very much for your...
Спасибо большое за вступительное слово. Если кому-то нужен русский перевод, поднимите руку. Или вы слышите мой идущий перевод, если те, кто слушает меня через наушники? Это хорошо. Я очень рад снова быть в Москве. Впервые за 14 лет я снова приезжаю в этот город. И, конечно, потрясающе наблюдать, как она изменилась за то время, что меня тут не было. Даже сильнее, чем за время между моим первым и вторым приездами. Первый раз я приехал в 90-е годы еще, в 97-м году. И я, конечно, не могу не оценить креативность, творческий потенциал россиян. Тема моего выступления сегодня это моя книга «Tyranny of Experts». Вы, наверное, знаете, что американцам свойственно очень себя пышно рекламировать, особенно в коммерческом аспекте. Я могу сказать, что в этом здании на первом этаже продается моя книга на русском языке. Вы можете там приобрести. Это была моя минутка коммерческой рекламы, моей собственной книги. Почему мы сегодня обсуждаем такую тему, как тирания экспертов? Я работаю в области экономического развития, того, как страны в разных странах мира борются с отставанием и бедностью, как они решают этот вопрос. И меня как раз беспокоит наличие такого феномена в области экономики, как тирания экспертов. Эти эксперты зачастую руководствуются благими намерениями, полагая, что они могут предложить технические решения, технократические решения. К проблемам развития. Якобы есть экспертное решение для любой проблемы развития, проблемы экономического роста стран скорее. Некоторые из этих проблем, они достаточно такие специфичные, и для них существуют очень технократические решения. Например, нехватка хорошего питания с витаминами – это такая проблема. И техническое решение для нее это это капсулы с витамином А, которые просто продаются или раздаются гражданам, чтобы решить эту проблему. Или, например, нехватка питьевой чистой воды, это главный фактор, ведущий к болезням в беднейших странах мира. И самое простое решение – это бурить и бурить, пока вы не достигнете подземных источников воды, и оттуда черпать чистую воду. И может показаться, что развитие – это такая несложная задача. Есть просто своего рода технические проблемы, и существуют соответствующие эксперты, которые могут предложить свое собственное техническое решение, каждый из них. И, возможно, развиваться не так сложно, если у нас есть достаточное количество экспертов. Может быть, эксперты могут счесть, что изучить какой-то земельный участок и прийти к выводу, что наилучшее использование для него – это заниматься там лесоводством, а не земледелием, допустим, не сельским хозяйством. Это может быть такое экспертное решение. Я хочу вам рассказать одну историю, которая иллюстрирует проблемы, связанные с этой концепцией экспертных решений. История эта имела место в Уганде, в округе Мубанде, где-то 7 лет назад, в 2010 году. Почти 10 лет назад. Селяне Мубенды были в церкви, когда вдруг услышали стрельбу на улице. Они выбежали из церкви, и их окружали люди с оружием, которые сжигали их дома, убивали их скот, расстреливали. И эти жители деревни, на них навели оружие и не дали им гасить огонь в домах, спасать жилье. И в пожаре погиб 8-летний ребенок. Это была трагедия. Эти вооруженные люди сжигали также их урожай на корню. И в конечном итоге 20 тысяч селян лишились земли, и их увели самих, их переселили, на самом деле, в другую деревню, в другой район, гораздо более бедный район. И вот на этой картине вы видите следы этого разрушения, на этой фотографии. А справа вы видите новое пристанище, где оказались эти жители деревни после того, как их туда под дулом автоматов запроводили. Там все было хуже, хуже дома, хуже была земля для возделывания. Почему это произошло? А потому что был проект по развитию. Всемирный банк счел, что этот участок должен использоваться для лесоводства. И, может быть, эксперты и не хотели, но их экспертные рекомендации были проведены в жизнь на, так сказать, кончике штыка за счет принудительного изъятия земельных участков у сельского населения Уганды. Такое, к сожалению, очень часто происходит в кейсах, имеющих отношение к экономическому развитию. И этот случай выделяется только потому, что он стал достоянием прессы. О нем сообщали Нью-Йорк Таймс, причем это был первополосный материал. А я сам из Нью-Йорка. Нью-Йорк Таймс — это и у нас газета номер 1 в городе, и она имеет всемирное, так сказать, хождение. И Всемирный банк, он оказался в центре скандала. И это насилие связали с проектом Всемирного банка. И Всемирный банк был вынужден опубликовать в Твиттере вот это сообщение на следующее утро, после того, как вышла эта статья, вышел этот материал. Я опубликовал статью Нью-Йорк Таймс в Твиттере, ссылку на нее. И они ответили мне именно, не всей аудитории Нью-Йорк Таймс, мне они ответили в Твиттере на мой пост со ссылкой. Они написали мне: мы очень серьезно относимся к этим обвинениям, мы занимаемся разбирательством этого инцидента, мы стремились улучшить жизни людей в Уганде и в Африке вообще. То есть они говорили о своих благих намерениях. Они говорили, что проведут расследование этой истории. Но так этого не произошло. Прошло 7 лет, и за эти 7 лет Всемирный банк никакого расследования так и не провел. И никто не потребовал от них ответа за ту роль, которую они сыграли вот в этой ситуации, в этой несправедливости, которая произошла с жителями этой деревни в Уганде. Это один из примеров тирании экспертов, когда эксперты дают такие рекомендации, которые в итоге претворяются в жизнь путем насилия, И экспертов с них никто никогда не спрашивает за последствия их рекомендаций. В этом и заключается тирания экспертов. Они изолированы, избавлены от последствий их собственных неверных решений. Но при этом, если бы они дают полезную рекомендацию и их никак не вознаграждают за плоды, это тоже правда. То есть у нас имеется ситуация, когда эксперты никак не отвечают ничем перед теми людьми, которые зависят от их решений. Это и я называю тиранией экспертов. Возможность экспертов навязывать решения, которые реализуются насильственным путем. Почему же я считаю, что насилие и вообще навязывание каких-то решений – это плохо? Ну, во-первых, в первую очередь, согласие, свободный выбор индивида, право человека на выбор, право человека сохранять право собственности на собственную землю, право тех же селян в Уганде жить и зная, что никто не отнимет их дома, не сожжет детей в доме, не убьет их скот, не спалит их посевы. Но это такое право, которое должны уважать за каждым человеком, соблюдать его все эксперты. И отсутствие интереса и уважения к таким правам людей – это сама по себе большая проблема. Уважение к правам бедных – это такая проблема, ее нехватка, дефицита среди экспертов. И поэтому подзаголовок моей книги – это «Забытые права бедных». Это большая проблема. Права простого человека, права бедных людей, определять свою собственную жизнь, делать свой собственный выбор, они очень часто игнорируются. В экономике существует такой тезис, что можно за кого-то решить, что для него лучше, что человеку лучше выбрать А не Б, и мы можем за человека решить, что вот для него лучше будет, если он выберет, мы лучше знаем. Это один из ключевых принципов экономики. Но, с другой стороны, если человек сам выбрал вот в экономике базовый принцип, что если человек выбрал А не Б, то мы уважаем их принцип. Мы исходим из того, что человек сам сделал этот выбор, то он знает, что для него лучше, и этот выбор правильный, если это свободный выбор. А если ему навязали выбор допустим, и он заключается в том, что он должен прекратить свое какое-то традиционное прежнее занятие. Вот он жил, допустим, на этой земле, выращивал какие-то посевы, у него был скот, его заставили под дулом автоматов отказаться от этого и выбрать какой-то другой пункт, переселиться в другое место, продать насильственно свою землю каким-то иностранным компаниям, которые будут развивать там какой-то природный заповедник, то можно заключить, что поскольку это выбор не свободный, навязанный, то, скорее всего, вследствие этого выбора их положение, их жизнь ухудшится. Поскольку этот выбор им навязан, и сами они его не выбрали бы, а они пошли на него только под давлением, мы можем заключить, что этот выбор будет им не на пользу. К сожалению, это только один из множества примеров безнаказанности экспертов в области развития, экономического развития, когда эксперты не уделяют должного внимания правам простых людей решать собственную жизнь, определять собственную жизнь. В экономике также есть посылка, что когда люди сами решают за себя, это лучший способ приходить к правильным решениям, чем когда эксперты, особенно иностранные, диктуют какие-то свои решения откуда-то извне или сверху, диктуя людям, что они должны делать. Мы полагаем, как экономисты, что когда люди выбирают сами, решают сами, что для них лучше, это более информированный выбор. Люди лучше знают для себя, что для них выгоднее. И кроме того, они лучше мотивированы для того, чтобы находить для себя оптимальные решения, находить для себя оптимальные способы. То есть они и мотивированы лучше, информированы лучше, чем какие-то внешние посторонние эксперты, которые повсюду постараются навязать людям свои решения. Как же работает этот выбор? Как все это решается в условиях рыночной демократии? когда люди могут свободно выбирать поставщиков услуг, поставщиков товар, как и есть свобода также поставлять что-то, свои услуги предлагать на рынке. Вот эта свобода выбора, она решает многие проблемы в условиях свободного рынка. А в плане демократии, демократической государственной системы люди выбирают себе правительство, выбирают партию, которая будет у власти, и они могут наказывать правительство, которое не удовлетворяет их ожиданиям, просто не выбирая в следующий раз. Они могут... Есть также вот право политического протеста. Трагедия ситуации той же Уганды в том, что у тех же фермеров не было возможности легально заявить как-то политически о нарушении их прав и заявить свой протест. Они были лишены такой возможности. И дело в том, что в Уганде авторитарное правительство, и фактически Всемирный банк, он находился, фактически взаимодействовал, сотрудничал с этим авторитарным правительством, подавляющим любые протесты. И в этих условиях не будет никакого выхода из бедности, будет только тирания экспертов, не будет решений. У этих ситуаций, у этих происшествий глубокие исторические корни. Интересный исторический прецедент был, конечно, можно найти в колониальном периоде в Африке, в ходе которого... Существует даже доклад, созданный в 1938 году британским колониальным режимом в Африке. Тысячестраничный доклад, в котором колониальные власти предлагали свои экономические решения для развития Африки как раз. Некоторые из них я уже упоминал в прошлом. Например, вот нехватка витаминов, плохое питание в Африке. Можно было как раз выпускать этот самый витамин А в капсулах, в пилюлях. Проблема питьевой воды, бурить скважины, искать воду, делать колодцы. Это было решение для дефицита питьевой воды.
Так, можно... Так. У нас возникла техническая трудность. Так, нормально? Здесь нормально работает? Хорошо? Все? Да. Так. Таким образом, это доклад колониальный британцев в XIX веке. Но никакого решения не было предложено для этой проблемы. Говорили, что малярия, недоедание и... Но ответ этой проблемы никто не мог предложить. Ответ был простой. Нужно было глубже бурить, чтобы добывать воду. И эти решения 70 лет спустя были подтверждены Организацией Объединенных Наций. И если посмотрите решения, которые предлагаются уже 100 лет спустя, те же самые решения, которые предлагались экспертами на протяжении многих десятилетий. И люди, которые претворяли в жизнь экспертные решения, и если вы посмотрите на колониальный доклад, это Хейли, который быстрый аристократ, который был экспертом в 1930 году, он утвердил этот отчет, и я не вижу. Так, и теперь я вижу, да. Так. Эксперты в 2005 году посмотрели еще раз. И они посмотрели, что это Борнео, который такая экспертка.
Aid agency, and again the World Bank, supporting the dictator of Ethiopia and creating model villages that look like this one. in which, again, there was coercion. Villagers were forced to leave their own villages that they had made for themselves. They were again marched away at gunpoint to go to these villages. This village actually wound up being abandoned, this model village that was created by the government that was the expert solution to the problems of these poor farmers. This village was never occupied, even though it was supposed to be the solution, and that was because it did not have enough water for the cattle. The experts had failed to take into account that this was a village that did not have water for the cattle, did not have enough water for the cattle to drink. So this is yet another example of the tyranny of experts. Unfortunately, these technical solutions are very, very popular. I think most of you have heard of Bill Gates. How many of you have heard of Bill Gates? Yes, the Microsoft billionaire who has gotten very involved through the Gates Foundation in creating economic development solutions. So Bill Gates actually praised the government of Ethiopia that was involved in this, together with the aid experts in creating this disaster. He praised the Ethiopian government for what he said. He said that the Ethiopian government helps us to deliver tools and services to everybody who will benefit. The Gates Foundation themselves has spent $265 million in Ethiopia. He said he had a great working relationship with the Ethiopian dictator, Meles Zenawi. And he praised Meles Zenawi, the Ethiopian dictator, who he said has made real progress in helping the people of Ethiopia. So Gates is very much embracing the technical approach to development, which unfortunately turns into the tyranny of experts, in which Ethiopian farmers are coerced to accept solutions that are not solutions, that are making things worse rather than making things better. He doesn't understand that dictators do not cause development, dictators cause poverty. Dictators are not the solution, dictators are the problem. So when Bill Gates praises the dictator of Ethiopia as the solution, he's getting it exactly backwards. He is praising the dictator as a solution for Ethiopian development when it's actually the dictator is the main obstacle to Ethiopian development. And again, the experts in the aid agencies, USAID, the UK Aid Agency, Department for International Development, the World Bank, they were all making the same mistake, that thinking the expert solutions, the tyranny of experts, is the answer, when it is really the problem rather than the solution. Now, I have to confess at this point that I myself was a former expert. I myself was an expert. I myself was involved in committing all of the sins that I have talked about today. And so I'm a sort of recovering expert. On this trip, I've had the opportunity to visit a lot of Russian Orthodox churches, which are very beautiful. And I've often felt the need to kind of repent for my past sins as an expert and try to get forgiveness for my own past sins as an expert and being complicit in this kind of tyranny of experts. So you might ask, what is my own expert plan to fix all of the problems that I've talked about this morning? What is my own expert solution to fix the problems that I've talked about? So here it is. If I can get it to work. Let's try again. I want this slide right here. Yeah. Yeah, it's the blank slide. Okay, let's skip that one if it's not working. It's okay, let's just go back to the presentation. Yeah, it's okay. So the next slide had nothing on it. I have no expert plan to fix the problem of too many expert plans. The problem is that we already have a surplus of too many expert plans. The World Bank, which I used to work for in my past career as a tyrannical expert, the World Bank calls itself the Knowledge Bank. The World Bank calls itself the Knowledge Bank as it's the fount of all expertise to solve the problems of development. And so the World Bank produces a lot of reports full of expert recommendations on how to solve the problems of development. Now, one interesting study that was done in the World Bank itself found that 31% of the World Bank's reports have never been downloaded. No one has ever downloaded them. A third of the World Bank reports have never been downloaded. So they were written, but nobody ever read them. World Bank reports were prepared with lots of expert solutions, but nobody ever read those reports. 87% of the World Bank reports have never been cited by anyone else. That was another finding of this study. So again, the problem is not a shortage of experts. The problem is a shortage of rights. We already have way too many expert plans. I could give you another expert plan, but it also would never be read, never be acted upon. So what is the point of expert plans? That they not only create a tyranny of experts, they don't even lead to any action happening whatsoever. So the history of progress is not driven by experts. It's driven by poor people themselves, solving their own problems through things like markets and democracy. So far this has been an unhappy story, but I want to end on the last part of this talk is about some positive stories on how people around the world are solving their own problems. So in Africa itself, you might think that one thing that experts often say that is very insulting to Africans is that Africans don't care about their own rights. And that is completely not true because, for one thing, there's a new book that has documented that there have been more than 90 political protests in more than 40 African countries over the past decade, protesting things like corruption and human rights violations. And these protests have partially been effective in causing a switch from dictatorship to democracy in Africa. Yeah, let's go back to that slide. Here's the, okay, it's working now. So this is, by the way, the World Bank, the results of the World Bank study that found that more than about a third of World Bank reports have never been downloaded. 87% were never cited by anybody else. So expert plans, we already have too many of them. Nobody is reading them. There are so many expert plans. And when they do happen, they happen coercively, like in the stories that I told you in Ethiopia and Uganda. But the good news is that when Africans are protesting about their own rights, they are succeeding in converting countries from dictatorships to democracies. So the number of dictators has, in blue here in this diagram, has been reduced from 1988 to 2012, and the number of democratic regimes has been increased. In the country of Ghana, a country that I like very much and have worked in many times, Ghana just held its 5th straight democratic election, free and fair democratic election, and had a peaceful transfer of power for the 5th time. Every 4 years, over the past 24 years, Ghana has had a free and fair peaceful election to transfer power. That's the happy news. As far as economic freedom, this graph shows a measure of the extent to which people are free to choose in markets, are free to have their property rights respected, are free to choose their own occupation. This is a measure of whether the farmers in Uganda or Ethiopia have the freedom to make their own choices or whether they're subject to coercion. So here the blue category is the most free economically people to make their own choices. The yellow is intermediate and the red is the least free. And you can see there's a strong upward trend in economic freedom. in things like freedom of markets, freedom of trade, freedom of entrepreneurship, freedom of finance to operate. So it is, we do have a successful trend towards more freedom for everyone around the world to make their own choices. And some of the specific examples of this, some of the results of this is that we think of Africa as this very poor, technologically backward place. But there are actually twice as many cell phone subscribers in Africa as there are in the United States. There's been an explosion of cell phones in Africa thanks to the explosion of markets and entrepreneurship. These are cell phone companies created by domestic African entrepreneurs that were free to make their own choices. Africans were free to make their own choices to spend their own money on cell phones, which are very productive for them for deciding where to sell their crops, where to meet business customers, how to have customers come to you to buy your products arranged by cell phone. Around the world, moving away from Africa, there's been a strong increase in world trade. This graph shows the average share of world trade in GDP in countries around the world. So this is the average for all countries of the world of what is their ratio of the total trade that they engage in as a share of their own gross domestic product. And you can see that over time there's been a strong upward trend towards increasing world trade. And so this reflects, again, this increasing freedom to choose, that people can find new opportunities around the world in making exports to sell to foreign markets that demand highly these products and to get rich by exporting. And this increased freedom of choice is associated with a large world boom. So the final slide that I'll show you today is the happiest story, that despite the folly and the tyranny of experts, world economic development is happening anyway. What this graph shows is the average per capita income of countries around the world from the year 1950 to the year 2015. And over that time, the average income of people in the world has increased by a factor of 4. The average income of people in the world has increased 4 times. It's today 4 times higher than it was in 1950. So development is happening anyway, despite the tyranny of experts. And even more development can happen if we have even less tyranny and even more freedom for people to choose. So if you really insist on an answer on what we should do to promote prosperity and development around the world, what we should do is simply to advocate for more freedom for everyone around the world. We should dismiss the illusion that experts have the solution, and we should allow people to have the freedom to find their own solutions, and openly join the battle of values on the side of the rights, on the side of freedom for everyone around the world. Freedom is winning the battle in the long run, but we know that there are many dangers, there are many threats to freedom in the world, and the battle is far from over. So we must convince many more that all people everywhere, women and men, black and white, rich and poor, of every religion, of every creed, of every color, every people everywhere deserves to be free at last. Thank you very much. I will now take your questions. Thank you very much.
По-русски будете задавать? Тогда сюда и в микрофон говорить. Есть микрофон, отлично.
Dear Mr. Easterly, from me personally, I thank you for excellent presentation. I will read it by all means. It is very interesting what to do with experts, because it is known that to solve the problems of people, what needs to be done is that people resolve their problems themselves. But first question is, do you think that experts exist not to impose their solutions and their opinions because their proposals cannot be absolute, but to cooperate with those who are willing to develop? This is the first question.
So one thing that speakers do in presentations is often overstate their case, and then the question and answer period is a very good time to correct and qualify the overly strong conclusions of the presentation. So now is the time to admit, yes, there is a valid role. There is a genuine role for experts. There is legitimate expertise that is valuable and will help solve problems. So how do we define what is a good role for experts and what is a bad role for experts? So a good role for experts is when the experts themselves are voluntarily chosen by people to solve their problems. So of course, a lot of us in our everyday lives are often consulting experts. If I get sick, I consult an expert doctor. If my car doesn't work, I consult an expert mechanic. If my water doesn't work, I consult an expert plumber. So the key thing there is that I am making the choice which experts I want. I have the power to hold them accountable if they fail to solve my problems. And so experts that are part of a system of freedom of choice in markets and democracy, that is a valuable role for expertise. And of course, there is an important contribution that technological expertise has to make to solve problems. Of course, technical solutions are part of the answer, but what is necessary to make technical solutions operate and make experts have a legitimate role is just that they themselves are subject to the freedom of choice of us as consumers and as democratic voters, as far as public policy experts, that we can reject or accept their solutions, and that they themselves will be democratically accountable to the people, or they will be accountable in markets to their customers. If that is the situation, then experts can indeed play a valuable, more modest, limited role, always subject to freedom of choice.
And this is very much like a well-known proverb in Russia. This principle of, ask if you need counsel, ask your wife and do the other way around. And maybe that's how you should treat some of the expert counsel once in a while. But that was a joke. Going further on, Africa is a backward continent. It's underdeveloped, let's say. What do you think Africans themselves think of it? Do they see their own continent as backward, as underdeveloped?
Yeah, so the question is, do Africans themselves see their own continent as backward, as underdeveloped? What do Africans think of their own development problems? So I think this is a very big question in development. How do we think about people that are less developed and more developed? How do people themselves think about their own situation when they are less developed, when they are so-called technologically backward? Actually, that's something that I think I want to write a whole new book about. So I hope I'll come back here with a new book in 3 or 4 years to give another talk. But I think the answer that economics, and I can only speak as an economist on this problem. So of course it is true that Africa is less developed according to measures like GDP per capita, technology, health, education, many indicators like that. Africa is indeed backward, as you say. But the insight of economics is that this is not because Africans are intrinsically themselves inferior in some way. So that's, of course, during colonial times, there was a lot of racism, that colonialists thought that the Africans needed colonialism because the colonial powers were offering to, the British thought that they were superior. They thought that as superior beings, they would offer development solutions to inferior Africans. Of course, that's a very insulting, racist way of thinking about development. It's also empirically false. The the cause of underdevelopment is not racial inferiority. That's a false view of development. The cause of underdevelopment is historical circumstances in which the West itself was complicit. You know, the slave trade helped make Africa poor. Colonialism helped make Africa poor. The oppression by the West of Africa helped keep Africa poor. And those are some of the causes and other historical causes of why Africa is poor. And so now, you know, Africans, I think, I've had very many pleasant interactions with Africans who are very grateful to have these stereotypes corrected of Africans as so-called backward people. In the US, the most highly educated immigrant group in the United States is Africans. They have a higher percentage of college degrees than any other immigrant group or any other native group. In the US, we now have lots of Nigerian brain surgeons, Nigerian pediatricians, Nigerian doctors. So clearly, you know, people that seem backward in one situation, when you give them more opportunity and transfer them to another situation like an economy with more technology and better institutions like the US, then you see the potential of Africans revealed in another situation, that indeed they can respond to opportunities in another situation. So the cause of poverty in Africa is circumstances and history, not anything inherent in the people themselves. I think that's something that is very important to say today, because there is still today so much racism around the world. Пожалуйста. Пожалуйста.
Сюда сначала. Следите за мной, не следите за залом. Да, вот девушки. А потом туда.
Thank you very much for your interesting and interesting presentation. It was a pleasure. I would like to ask where your analysis leaves development aid. And development aid has been criticized in the recent years quite a lot, but arguably it has also led to some good outcomes in, for example, in the spheres of public health. So
Yeah.
where does this leave traditional development aid? Thank you.
Yes, well, I get that question a lot. So again, just like with experts, there's good aid and bad aid. The bad aid tends to happen more likely in situations where aid is given by official aid agencies directly to governments in poor countries that are themselves authoritarian governments, dictatorships. So that's kind of bad aid, is official aid given to dictatorships that often leads to negative consequences like the ones we've talked about today, rather than positive consequences. And frankly, some of this aid is politically motivated, and that's why maybe the aid does not work very well, is because it's not only a humanitarian motive, but also a political motive. So the Ethiopia and Uganda were allies of the US and the UK in the war on terror internationally. And that's the reason the US and the UK wanted to give a lot of aid to the dictators in Ethiopia and Uganda. And that's one of the reasons why aid did not work very well. And the problem here is just that so many development people are naive about this and expect good things to happen, like Bill Gates is expecting, which aid has had positive results, like the ones you mentioned. The field in which aid has had the most positive results is health. And I think it is because health is an area perhaps that it is easier to have more expert solutions, and we don't need to rely as much on respecting the rights of the poor, because everyone does want vaccines. So, you know, a lot of the successes in health are just spreading everywhere, making vaccinations available to everyone, or making, antibiotic medicine available to everyone. And of course, everyone wants antibiotics, everyone wants vaccines, and so maybe the problem of rights is not as much of an issue in that field as it is in other areas. And so that's an area where aid has had more positive results in health. And also, I think some of the non-government organizations that do aid are more likely to have positive results than the official aid agencies, because their aid is less political.
I may continue just a little bit. So you would rather, in these sort of countries where the regime is authoritarian, you would rather steer the aid to NGOs or grassroots organizations? Or
Yes, well, I mean, I definitely think that aid that is official, U.S. aid or British aid or World Bank aid that is going to dictators should be stopped. I think that is doing harm rather than good. And some of that money could be diverted to go directly to NGOs that help people in the field, but also could go to other countries that are more democratic, like Ghana, the example that I gave earlier. Instead of going to a dictator, it could go to a more democratic government. So those are some of the options that are available once you move away from more destructive aid that is supporting dictators and helping dictators stay in power longer because they're getting aid.
Thank you very much. I'm not an economist, I'm a demographer. I come from Vienna, Austria. But I've worked on world population and global health and global education issues, and I'm sort of still struggling with what actually should be the priorities in international development. And I've read the Tyranny of Experts and several of your previous books, and I can follow you largely to what you say and to what you said today. But there is one point where I sort of tend to disagree. Don't people, in order to secure their own rights, have to be empowered to a certain degree? They have to have a good basic health and some basic education. I mean, illiterate people have a very difficult time securing their, getting the information and in a modern world, securing their rights. So my view is that it's really there is a rationale for basic health and basic education to empower people, but then it should stop. Then they should sort out their own things. But when I looked what you wrote on education, I sort of found some of your previous books that saying, well, education is something that people will get themselves, that they find it useful. But that's not what the historical experience told us. Throughout, like 500 years ago, and when the Reformation started in Germany and then spread to the Nordic countries, it always has been the universal literacy of the entire population that empowered them to development, to improve their health status, to create the good democratic institutions that we enjoy in some parts of the country, and where democracy has made progress in developing countries. It also mostly has been in the context of more educated, more literate, at least at the basic level people. So wouldn't you agree that there is a case for investing, and this would sort of be the benign health, to empower people through basic education to then sort out their own issues?
Yes, well, thank you for your question. I very much respect your point of view. This is a very old debate. Let me read you a quote that comes from colonial times. A British colonial official said in 1943, "We should not concentrate on the pursuit of political ideals to the detriment of the preeminent need for improving the physical and social conditions." This was very much the view in colonial times, that these basic needs of education, literacy, health came first, and then people would be fit for democratic self-government. In those times, that was an excuse for denying colonial subjects their rights, their political rights, for perpetuating colonialism, for making colonialism last longer. So, I respect the argument. I'm also somewhat suspicious of the argument, because it's autocrats such as colonialists, but also today's dictators, often use this argument to say, well, let's wait. Let's put off the advent of political rights for our subjects, for our citizens. Let's wait until they have more health, until they have more education, and only after that will happen, then we'll give them rights. So I'm suspicious of that argument, because it's so often used as an excuse to perpetuate the lack of rights, the dictatorship. I think and as I mentioned earlier, Africans are not happy with that status quo. There's so many political protests in so many countries against this kind of status quo, even though there is still relatively low level of health and education. I remember, my own country, the US, when we started our path as somewhat partially becoming a democracy in 1776, we were at the income level and the education level that is below what Africa is today. And many other European countries have the same experience, that they were starting their path towards democracy and political rights at a very low level of education and health compared to what exists today. So I respect the argument, and I will respectfully disagree. I think we should not use any of these arguments as an excuse to wait any longer for political rights for the poor, for democracy for the poor. I think they want it right away. They deserve to get it right away.
Just to follow up, I think these are really two different questions, and using them as an excuse, as you said, is certainly not right. But of course, there are also examples where under democratic rule, like in India, half of the population is left behind in illiteracy and misery. And so democracy is not a guarantee for empowerment of the masses. And so I think these are somewhat different, but not completely unrelated, I agree.
I'm glad we're having this dialogue. You know, I think also we should not. One temptation that we always have in development is to imagine that there's some utopia that is available. There's some kind of utopian solution that is available. Well, I'm sorry to say this, but there is no utopian solution available. Democracy is a very messy, imperfect system, like Winston Churchill said, the worst system except for all the other ones. But it's a step forward towards, and you know, democracy is about much more than majority voting like in India. It's also about some of the things that are very lacking in India, like, you know, protection of the rights of minorities, protection of the rights of individuals against the power of the state, against the tyranny of the majority. And so those are things that are still a work in progress in India. So democracy is always a work in progress like that, but it's better than all the other alternatives.
So, Mr. Easterly, thanks a lot.
Yes, Nadia.
Yeah.
Yes.
It was really interesting to get to know your book. And you've said that local people even don't have the possibility to choose plan A or plan B. They have definite needs, culture, agriculture, but experts don't understand them. And here goes the example with the new village and lack of water for the cattle. And these experts live in developed countries, so maybe they even don't have enough expertise. And speaking in words of business English, local population is a target audience for these experts. And my question is, how can experts understand the real demands and needs of the local population?
So yeah, how can experts know enough to understand the needs of the local population? I think that's really the problem, is that they can try very hard, but it's very hard to get enough local knowledge to have a well-informed, good expert solution to the needs of local people. Local people themselves know their own situation much better than the outside experts, especially when the experts are foreign experts like me, you know, a World Bank expert flying in from Washington, staying at the luxury hotel in the capital, trying to figure out the needs of people on the ground. Another example of a project in Africa that showed kind of the limitations of experts was there was a classic study of a World Bank project in Lesotho, a country surrounded by South Africa, in southern Africa, in which the World Bank experts tried very hard to make the locals succeed at farming. And the locals were just not very willing to do what the experts said, and it seemed like they were lazy. They were not willing to do any of the recommendations of the experts to do farming. And it turned out later, when an anthropologist came in and spent 3 years living with the villagers in Lesotho, where this project was happening. So this is a case where an outside expert got enough knowledge, but only by living with the villagers for 3 years as an anthropologist. He found out two things. One is that the soil in this region was very, very poor. It was very unsuitable for farming. And that's one of the reasons why the farmers, so-called farmers, were so lazy. They did not want to do farming because the soil was too poor to do farming. The other thing that he found out is that these so-called farmers were not actually farmers at all. They had a much better plan B, which was to be migrant workers to the mines in South Africa, to go to the diamond and gold mines and earn much more money in the diamond and gold mines as migrant workers than they could have made from farming. And so after living with them for 3 years, an expert finally was able to figure out why the experts were wrong to try to impose farming, because the soil was not suitable. They did not want to be farmers. They had better options than farming. That's how easy it is for experts to get things wrong, and how hard it is for experts to get things right, that it takes years and years of living with locals. So we could try to insist that all experts spend 3 years living with the locals before they propose a solution, which would be extremely expensive. Or probably the better solution is to just let local people solve their own problems because they already have enough knowledge and enough incentive to solve their own problems, to give them the tools to solve their own problems rather than relying on outside experts.
And what is the system of giving recommendations from experts? So they just ask local population, or maybe that's their theory?
Supposedly they try to ask local population, but again, it's very hard as an outside expert that doesn't speak the language, that doesn't understand local conditions, that doesn't know all of the political and economic and social and cultural factors in which people are giving answers to your questions. It's actually very, very hard for outsiders to figure out these solutions. And that's the inherent limitation of outside experts as answers to people's problems. And that's why people themselves know much more about solving their own problems than outsiders do.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I would like to follow up on some of the questions that were asked before. And I'm specifically truly interested in your opinion on China, because I have missed the first part of the presentation, and I wonder if you consider the Chinese model of development aid as somehow different to the traditional Western model, because I think the opinion on China is very polarized, and some even recipient countries or partner countries, they're saying that China is giving them exactly the freedom of choice, which Western aid doesn't often give in terms of, I don't know, China invests more in infrastructure and some other things that countries prioritize. But on the other end of this scale of the polarized opinion is the fact that China is exactly supporting dictatorships, as you were saying before. So I wonder, what's your take on China and on China as a development assistance donor, not as on China as a developing country itself. And my second question is that right now you have been speaking about how hard it is for outsiders to actually understand the local problems and to propose some solutions. And you were saying that freedom of choice and democracies and things like that, they work. So don't you think that that's exactly the way the outsiders view? So we outside of these countries think that for them it's better to develop local rights instead of, for example, basic services as health and education. So we are not exactly asking them. Maybe they would think that basic education is a priority. So just a reflection on some of the other questions. Thank you.
Yeah. Let me answer your second question first, which is a very important question. So I think there's often a paradox in these. Sometimes there are strong Western efforts to promote democracy or promote markets and freedom of choice in other countries. And sometimes it even involves, military invasion, like George W. Bush thought he was bringing democracy to Iraq by invading Iraq. And let's be clear very, very clear on this. There's an inherent contradiction in these kind of efforts that are trying to force other people to have what we as Americans or Western experts think is our view of what democracy and rights consists of. So it's almost as if like the freedom is the right to be uncoerced, to be free from coercion. So there's a contradiction that, we are invading you, we are coercing you to have the right to be not coerced. That's contradictory. We are coercing you to not be coerced. It just doesn't work logically, right? So freedom can only emerge from people themselves demanding freedom for themselves. freedom cannot be imposed from outside by experts. That's itself inherently contradictory and self-defeating for outside experts to try to impose their own view of freedom and rights on someone else. People have to develop their own understanding of what they want for their own, how they define their own desired rights, and then implement themselves their own desired rights and assert their own desired rights. I think the role of countries like my own country, the US, is simply not to be supporting the wrong side, not to be supporting the dictators. Like, the examples of supporting dictators in Ethiopia and Uganda because they were just allies in the war on terror. It used to be during the days of the Cold War, both the Soviet Union and the US were supporting dictators simply because they were allies in the Cold War. And a lot of aid misfired because of those reasons, for the same reasons. So today the situation should be that aid should respect the rights of the poor and not be supporting dictators for any reason, for any political reason. But then the rights are themselves determined by people themselves. People discover for themselves what rights they want, and in fact, I do observe people often will make claims that, oh, this society doesn't care about individual rights, this society doesn't care about democracy. I don't really believe those claims. I believe that these are fairly universal aspirations, that people everywhere desire to have the freedom for self-determination, the freedom to determine their own choices, their own lives, to control their own lives, to not be coerced by the government, and to not be coerced by other people, to have the freedom to make your own choices. I believe these are fairly universal aspirations around the world. But the way that these are implemented institutionally and implemented in practice should emerge spontaneously from people themselves and not be imposed from outside. Now, on the China question, a couple of things to say about that. So, of course, China is an important counterexample to what I've been saying. I've been saying dictators are really bad for development, and China is a great success story under a dictatorship. So I will freely concede that is a counterexample. Of course, there are many more counterexamples of disastrous outcomes for development under dictators. There's the Democratic Republic of the Congo that used to be Zaire. Under that dictatorship, there has been a long-running disaster happening. There's the dictator Hugo Chavez in Venezuela and his successor, which has led to a catastrophe in Venezuela under that dictatorship, under that denial of political rights and political suppression. So, dictators every now and then will have spectacular successes like China or Singapore, but then there are many, many more examples of either mediocre results or disasters. So we need to use all of the evidence and not just China to decide which is better. So why does China have such success? I think the main thing to remember is that China's success is mainly about growth out of poverty. So China is still at a relatively low level of per capita income compared to those of the mature democracies in the United States and Western Europe. So it's still still lagging behind. And we could argue that China is going to need to move into a situation of more political rights and a transition to democracy if it's ever going to be able to attain the same level of per capita income as the US or Western Europe or Japan or South Korea or Taiwan, the mature democracies around the world that have attained a high level of income. And why has the growth been so rapid? You could say, I think a solution that most people found plausible is that it was a very successful transition from a very centrally planned economy to giving much more economic rights to Chinese entrepreneurs to produce exports for the world market. Much more rights, economic rights for Chinese entrepreneurs and workers to get rich, selling, clothing and many, many other exports to the world market. And that has been the vehicle. So it's really markets, freedoms, economic freedoms that have been the main success story in China.
Thank you. I have more of a comment rather than a question. It's difficult not to agree with you about your point about supporting or not supporting dictatorships or repressive governments. That's, of course, makes a lot of sense. But then supporting these sort of the grassroots organizations, the democratic initiatives that come from the people, that's really not a simple task, because quite often these small organizations are also not very efficient. They are also not free from corruption, and in countries with poor rule of law, it's really hard to monitor these sort of small projects. And thinking of development aid channel to these organizations, it's a difficult puzzle. It's really not that simple, in my opinion. I've seen many small development projects that, because of lack of monitoring or the difficulties of monitoring, have gone terribly wrong, and it's just a really difficult task.
Yeah, no, thank you for that comment. I want to make clear that I'm not talking about the way to achieve democracy and rights as being something that is mainly going to be up to foreign aid or experts, or foreign aid experts. Again, it's going to emerge mainly from people demanding their own rights. And as you say, it's not simple. It's never been simple for people to get their democratic rights. It took a long struggle in the US and Western Europe and Japan and Taiwan and South Korea and these other examples of successful democracy to fight for rights. It took many, many years of people advocating for rights. And of course, it also includes minorities advocating for their own rights, like the civil rights movement in the US, black people advocating for the end of segregation, the end of voting restrictions on blacks. That took Martin Luther King and other civil rights advocates many years of efforts and advocacy. So, but again, this is not something that is mainly a task for foreign aid to do, of outside experts trying to promote the growth of democracy. It's mainly something that people, the people that are best at advocating for democracy are the people who are getting it for themselves. People who, outsiders who are trying to promote democracy for someone else are not very effective or very knowledgeable or have the right incentives. They have all the same tyranny of expert problems that I've been talking about. But the people who are most highly motivated about individual rights are the people who are fighting for their own rights, their own individual rights. And it may take them a long time, and there may be some bad, ineffective organizations that fail to achieve it along the way. There may be corruption, there may be disasters. It's a very uneven path. There are no utopian solutions. It takes a long time, but it is winning over time. Democracy is winning in the long run. It is growing over time, so we have hope that it can continue winning all around the world, even though today it seems even more under threat than it has at any time in recent history.
Yeah, I see your point. This democratic struggle, it's as I said, it's hard for an outsider to support that, or to know how to support that, and then it's morally it's a difficult thought to just leave the countries alone, the other countries, to just leave the struggle be. It's a difficult morally, it's a difficult thought, but I see your point.
Okay. I can hear you a little bit, yes. Speak very loud. Yeah, yes. Oh, sure, for sure. Local experts who get education and then go back to their homeland are an important part of the answer. I work with another professor at New York University named Yao and Yarko, who's a Ghanaian from Ghana. And he himself is one of the leading African economists in the world. He got an education in Ghana and then got educated in the US to get a PhD in economics. And he's been an important part of the solutions back in his home country. Ghana has gone back. He's still based in New York, but he travels frequently to Ghana and brings back to Ghana, many technological and economic and institutional solutions that Ghanaians are consulting him, asking for his advice. The new government that just got elected in the election includes some of his childhood schoolmates and classmates, and he's going to be very involved in the new government, kind of determining policies and solutions in Ghana. So I think that is actually one of the best, if we try to think of kinds of aid that can help, and I think that I'm sure this will be a popular recommendation with this audience, I think one of the best kinds of Western aid is to give just lots of scholarships to local people to get more education and more knowledge, to develop expertise that they can then bring back home and be local experts. I would not, by the way, I would not necessarily coerce the local experts to go back home. I would not put that, I would not take away their own freedom to choose themselves whether they're going to go back home or whether they will remain in the US or Europe. I don't want to force them to go back home. I think that's a mistake that is often made in these scholarship programs. Because people, voluntarily care about their own homelands, and they will voluntarily engage in lots of useful advice, even if they're not forced to go back home. And they will engage in lots of useful dialogue and advice for their home countries.
Other questions?
The last question. As far as I can see, the development institutions such as World Bank, USAID, and so on could not do but work with local governments, because they are themselves intergovernmental or governmental organizations. They could not avoid to make some diplomacy to make ties with local governments. That means dictators. Do you mean it's time to dismantle World Bank and so on totally? Because they could not do anything but collaborate with dictators.
Well, it's actually, I don't actually necessarily agree that their only option is to collaborate with dictators, because there are democratic governments around the world they could work with. And, unfortunately, they have actually been going really in the wrong direction. I was studying some data of what has happened since 2001, mostly because of the war on terror. Most aid has been going to the worst governments in the world. It's been going to places like Afghanistan that has corruption, dictatorship, warlords. It's been going to the examples that I gave earlier. It's been going to more aid has been going to dictators since 2001 than was the case before then. And it's bypassing regimes that are more democratic and more accountable to their own citizens, like Ghana and Benin and many other countries in Latin America and Asia that have more democratic regimes. So, perversely, the World Bank aid and the US aid and UK aid is going to the worst dictatorships, when it does have the option of going to at least, again, there are no perfect governments anywhere in the world, including in my country, of course. And you're never going to find a perfect government, but there are dictatorships, there are in-between countries, and there are democracies, and the aid has been going in the wrong direction towards the worst governments. It could do much better going to better governments. So I wouldn't necessarily say they should be abolished. They should only be abolished if they refuse to respect the rights of the poor. If they really refuse to respect the rights of the poor, then I think yes, they should be abolished. But if they are willing to respect the political and economic rights of the poor, to not have horrible things continue happening like the examples I gave for Ethiopia and Uganda, then I think they could have a positive role supporting more freedom as it is emerging around the world.
Our time is out. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Я напоминаю, что книгу, которой посвящена
The book which devoted to our meeting can be bought in the shops and stands in the buildings of our academy. And there's a special place not far away from the place where the books are distributed for free. There you can buy this book, The Tyranny of Experts. Thank you.